Welcome to this week's episode of the Readout LOUD, a weekly biotech podcast from Stat. I'm Allison DeAngelis.
I'm Adam Feuerstein. Remember me? I've been out for 3 episodes. It felt like 3 years, but happy to be back.
And I'm Damian Garde. I've sadly been here the whole time.
It's Thursday, October 12th, and here's what we're going to talk about this week.
Merger Monday has returned to biotech thanks to Bristol Myers Squibb's multibillion-dollar acquisition of Mirati Therapeutics. We'll talk about what the deal means for an industry in an ongoing slump.
We'll also discuss the latest news in the life sciences, including Wall Street's Ozempic panic, CRISPR'ing animals, and the next step in the NASH saga.
All that after a word from our sponsor.
From breakthroughs in drug developments to inside scoops on billion-dollar deals, join us October 18th and 19th for the annual Stat Summit. This year's speaker lineup is one you won't want to miss and includes Michael J. Fox, Priscilla Chan and Mark Zuckerberg, Nubar Afeyan, Emma Walmsley, and Daniel Skrovansky. They'll discuss their groundbreaking work in the lab and the boardroom and its impact on the future of health and medicine. Virtual and in-person tickets in Boston are selling fast, so don't miss this incredible lineup. Secure your Stat Summit ticket today at statnews.com/events.
So Adam, you're back, and what a week to be back, because we've got a lot to talk about.
Hi, everyone. I hope you all miss me. It's good to be back in the saddle. We should start the conversation, this podcast with we always like to start with an M&A deal if there is one to talk about. And this week we had Bristol Myers Squibb buying Mirati Therapeutics, a maker of targeted cancer drugs, for $4.8 billion plus, I guess, a $1 billion sweetener. Damien, what were your thoughts when you saw that? I guess the news came out Sunday as we were all weekending.
Well, I saw it Monday morning, as someone who tries to observe his weekend when it's possible, especially a long weekend. That's probably enough autobiographical details.
Why does the biotech industry do this to us, if I can interject? Like, there's always big news on a holiday weekend. That's just rude.
And it's one of those holidays that, I don't know, it's kind of one of those weird holidays where some people don't observe, I guess. I don't know. Well,
that's true. Anyway, Damien, what did you make of the deal?
Well, I mean, I thought it was interesting because this followed another saga, not unlike the NASH saga we're going to talk about later. Mirati's highest profile drug is a cancer drug targeting KRAS, the formerly perceived to be undruggable cancer target, formerly the subject of great enthusiasm about the potential of medicines against it, more recently the subject of tempered expectations, if not some... I don't know. I wouldn't want to say indignation, but we talked about last week I think we did, Amgen, which makes a KRAS medicine of its own, really going through it with the FDA with respect to whether that medicine is as powerful as it once seemed. And while Mirati's drug is obviously different, it has been subject to the ebbs and flows of the KRAS story, and its stock price kind of tells that story naturally. So Bristol Myers coming in at this exact moment and buying it for that exact price felt interesting, both because it would suggest that, and Mirati has more in its pipeline than just the KRAS treatment, but it would suggest that there is some value there in the eyes of Bristol, but also, Adam, as you wrote, the actual takeout price was what we call a take under, which is to say that the per share acquisition price was below where Mirati had been trading, but obviously the company said yes to this deal. And there's more to it. There's, money tied to the back end of it to where shareholders will get paid if certain conditions are met. But it still felt like a little sobering, perhaps, despite the headline number and the fact that any big drug company buying a smaller drug company is ostensibly a good sign for the market as a whole.
Yeah, I agree with that, Damien. I think, you can look at the $5 billion exit valuation from Mirati and compare that to about 3 years ago when the company was worth $12 billion. I think what that tells you is obviously it tells you that, the market was overinflated probably back then, as we all know, and biotech has been in a sort of rather prolonged slump. But I think it also reflects the fact that while there was a lot of enthusiasm for KRAS, this sort of was, known as an undruggable cancer target, which then became druggable through some pretty cool science. But, translating that science into a profitable business and generating sales has been difficult. Amgen has a KRAS targeted drug, as does Mirati, and both companies have not done a great job of sort of translating that science into sales. And there's been, the struggle has been sort of broadening the sort of the efficacy of that drug. Right now, it's used on its own, and there have been various efforts to show that combination therapies, for instance, let's say a combination of a KRAS inhibitor with like a checkpoint inhibitor. The jury is still out as to whether that is going to sort of increase the pool of patients who benefit from this drug. So I think all of that sort of is reflected in this kind of depressed stock price, depressed acquisition price that Bristol is buying Mirati.
Yeah, I mean, looking at Amgen, its closest competitor, there, are kind of a couple of like, not distressing, but depressing, aspects of their KRAS drug, which I have to imagine there's a fair amount of follow on for Mirati there, or a fair amount of influence. I mean, one that Amgen was in front of the FDA last week to try and get full approval for their drug, which right now has accelerated approval. And the data that they presented was like, yes, there is an effect on, progression-free survival, but patients taking this KRAS drug there wasn't an effect on overall survival, which for a cancer target that was as exciting as it was, you would hope that there was an impact on overall survival. And then even before this FDA meeting, Amgen has not been having the sales with its KRAS drug, Lumakras, that it had been hoping for. It really was hoping for, a blockbuster drug, and sales have been not where they wanted. So, I mean, Adam, you had wrote that it seems like at this point, the conversation has kind of evolved past the KRAS drugs, at least in terms of Mirati and the excitement to some of the other products in its pipeline, right?
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, the deal includes, basically what's called the CVR, about $1 billion, or I think $12 per share, and that is, that would be paid out to Mirati shareholders based on the successful development of a different drug that Mirati has. It's a drug that targets something called PRMT5. There's been some excitement about it. Mirati has some very early data a couple of months ago showing some interesting activity in solid tumors. Amgen actually has one, a PRMT5 inhibitor as well. I think they're actually showing some data tomorrow, that's Friday, at a cancer meeting. So, I think that might be an interesting target, and that ultimately may be a more lucrative drug, coming out of this deal. I mean, I think it'll take a while to determine that.
It's interesting. I mean, so this is, we love an M&A Monday. We haven't gotten a lot of them this year. PitchBook and the National Venture Capital Association just put out their new quarterly data this morning on Thursday, and they had said that so far for biotech and pharma, this is just the 56th. We've had 56 exits so far this year. I actually don't think that the Mirati exit is included in that, so maybe 57. I mean, last year, 2022, which was not a good year, 89 exits. 2021, 195 exits. The industry just, continues to be in this slump, and some of that PitchBook data was rather sobering, I have to say, as someone who, looks at venture capital numbers a lot. It was not what I think we have all been hoping for late 2023.
It was interesting kind of stitching it all together, because zooming out, we understand all of these things are interrelated. So the number of major buyout deals that happen from a company like Bristol Myers Squibb acquiring a company like Mirati Therapeutics tends to have kind of like a trickle-down effect. And so the number of those deals are down. We had data, I think, just this morning from Leerink suggesting that there have been 15 such acquisitions this year, which is tracking well below previous years, 30 to 40% below what had been seen from 2019 through 2021. And so then, as you mentioned, the exits for venture capital, which is say like IPOs or acquisitions of private companies, those tend to track with whether companies that go public can get acquired. So as one number goes down, the other number goes down. And as you covered with the PitchBook data, the number of actual venture capital deals, likewise, was trending at a 6-year low. And so we're just kind of watching this all play out in slow motion. The like long biotech correction just has all of these, I guess, like trailing indicators of what we've kind of seen and understood to be happening. And the search that many people have for silver linings remains mostly theoretical. Like it's not in the numbers, but you constantly hear from people that 2024 looks like it will be better based on, whatever leading indicators they may point to. But at least all of the data we have suggests that the slump continues.
Yeah. And like even beyond just financing, it feels like the news out of biotech companies is still rather dampened. Damien, you also wrote this week about Alnylam, a company that, has just been on such a confident stride these last few years, getting a rejection from the FDA. What happened there?
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a curious issue. And I think we spoke about it on the podcast before. Alnylam has this treatment that was in development for a once perceived to be rare, now understood to be fairly prevalent heart disease. And presented data from a clinical trial where that their medicine met its primary endpoint, and it went through the FDA advisory committee process where those data were picked apart pretty aggressively, and there was a multitude of opinions on just how much Alnylam's medicine actually benefited patients, but that panel did vote 9-3 that the benefits outweighed the risks, and thus it ought to be approved. The FDA, we learned this week, did not see it that way and declined to approve the drug, saying, according to Alnylam, basically that the evidence they had was insufficient. This is not a massive blow to the company per se, because their future in treating this disease is largely tied to basically an updated version of this same medicine that can be dosed subcutaneously rather than intravenously, and thus would be a lot more convenient and therefore more competitive on the market. But it is interesting in that it forces Alnylam, a company that has been very successful in recent years, and as former CEO John Maraganore likes to point out, has never failed in a phase 3 clinical trial, which I think is rare for a biotech company that's been around that long. But they're suddenly now facing this really binary event, which is whether that subcutaneous treatment can actually make a difference on measures of hospitalization and death for patients with this heart disease. Those data are expected in early 2024, and whether they're positive, the degree to which they're positive will have a massive effect on Alnylam's future as a business, which is, that's a tough position to be in. Obviously, the company is very confident. The science makes sense. It seems like the drug ought to work, but we've seen, time and again in biotech, but specifically in this disease, things that seem like they're going to work end up not working. So it's less of a period than an ellipses for Alnylam, but it's definitely one that changes the narrative slightly.
Yeah, it also feels like a little bit of an ellipses for this company that just like feels like the little engine it could. Every time I want to count out BridgeBio, they just seem to kind of come back with some financing, with some, promising clinical trial data. They're also working on a treatment for the same condition, right, Damien? Do we know how, those clinical trials that they're each running compare to one another? Like how the treatments compare and how the data that they're collecting might compare?
Yeah, so BridgeBio had data in July from a phase 3 study in this same disease, which was powered, unlike Alnylam's prior one, to detect differences in hospitalization and death for patients with, and the disease is called ATTR-CM, we should say, which is ATTR with cardiomyopathy. That trial was a success, and we saw the full details of the data at a later medical meeting. And so essentially that means BridgeBio has the kind of data, it seems like, the FDA would want to approve its medicine, which would allow it to compete with the only approved medicine for this disease, which is a Pfizer drug that was approved in 2019, and whose data are hard to compare to these other drugs because they conducted their studies when the standard of diagnosis and treatment for this disease was different, such that, this is not to disparage Pfizer's data, it was very, very strong. But everybody says now, if you ran that study today, it would look quite different because medicine advances. Anyway, so the current state of play is the assumption is BridgeBio will win approval. It plans to submit those data, I believe, by the end of this year. And so presumably that approval would come next year. Alnylam would follow after that. So what it really depends on is, like I said, how positive, if Alnylam's data are positive, how positive they are compared to the Pfizer data that already exists. Patients in that study will likely will have access to the Pfizer drug, which kind of complicates matters. And then furthermore, how they stack up to the Bridge study, which was similar endpoints. It will always be apples to apples comparing clinical trials that are not identically designed, and these are not. But they're in the same ballpark of looking at mortality, looking at ultimate patient outcomes when they get one of these medicines. And I honestly have no idea how the market will shake out. I don't think anyone really does. The Bridge Bio treatment is oral. The Alnylam is an injectable. This is a serious and fatal disease if it is not treated, which suggests that perhaps, the convenience factor will maybe not be as strong as it might be for something more symptomatic and not as grave. But I mean, I've heard countless opinions on this matter, and I think it really boils down to, we'll just have to see what the data say.
All right, Adam, you wrote about some other woes in the biotech world early this week. What's going on with Akero?
So I feel like a week does not go by where we don't see the impact in some form or another of the GLP-1 class of obesity drugs. And this week, that impact came in the form of a clinical trial that was run by a company called Mirati Therapeutics. They are developing a drug for NASH, which is a fatty liver disease, obesity-related fatty liver disease. And they did a study in a patients who had really advanced NASH. So these are patients that have advanced to the point where basically they have cirrhosis of the liver, which is at the point where scarring and fibrosis accumulates in the liver to the point where you start getting significant liver damage, and ultimately leading to probably the requirement that patients have a liver transplant. And what's interesting about cirrhosis NASH, or cirrhosis related to NASH, is that this is a patient population that was thought to be kind of insulated from the whole GLP-1. NASH as a disease has really been impacted because of the fact that it is obesity related, and the prevailing thought here is that patients who have earlier stages of NASH, if they just lose some weight, it helps regress the disease, and so a lot of doctors are now thinking that that GLP-1s will be a kind of a preferred treatment option for patients with NASH, and that sort of leaves the companies like Akero, who are developing drugs specifically for NASH, kind of leaves them a little bit on the outside. So this study was really people had some high hopes for the study because, again, this patient population, very advanced with cirrhosis, was thought, well, this is a patient population which really is not going to be helped by the GLP-1s. Unfortunately, the study did not work. The results were rather disappointing. I mean, while it did show some effect on liver scarring, it did not achieve the primary goal of the study. Did not reach statistical significance, and as a result, Akero's stock price fell. It was a bloodbath for Akero. Stock fell down about 60%. That was about $1 billion in market value that was erased from the company. And I personally was sort of surprised, I got to say, by the magnitude of that loss. When I got the results and the company had given them to me and other reporters under embargo, I thought to myself, well, it'll probably be down maybe 30%, because, there is still this idea that GLP-1s, for all their benefits on weight loss, they don't really do anything to improve liver scarring or liver fibrosis, so that there's still a market for these NASH drugs in some form. 17 million Americans apparently have some form of NASH, some stage of NASH. And I thought, GLP-1s are not going to just decimate that market. I feel like maybe I'm a little bit wrong there because, the fact is that, I think what this reaction in Akero stock price does show that I think people are they're very worried that GLP-1s are just going to sort of dominate the NASH treatment market, that there isn't really a place for NASH only drugs in patients in earlier stages of disease. And so far as anyone with more advanced NASH that's kind of trending into cirrhosis, we still don't really have an effective drug. And I mean, the verdict is not out yet on the Akero drug because, they're going to treat patients for longer. The company told me that they feel like maybe they didn't treat patients long enough. They treated them for 36 weeks. If they treat them for longer, I think they're going to go out to another year's worth of treatment. You may see more of a benefit, but again, that remains to be seen.
It's interesting to see such a significant market impact from GLP-1s, where it feels like we should note that we don't really have any solid data yet showing that GLP-1s reduce fatty liver disease. That's just kind of the assumption that's out there in the ether.
Right. The GLP-1s have been studied in NASH, and what's interesting is you haven't really seen an impact on the fibrosis, and that's kind of that's the sort of hallmark of NASH, it's where the real damage occurs in the liver, and we haven't seen that. But I think there is this idea that if you catch people in the earliest stages of NASH, where it's more about the fat accumulating in the liver and the inflammation in the liver, that GLP-1s can have an impact there. I mean, it is just stepping back. It's just remarkable how many areas in healthcare, or even just the general economy, that GLP-1 obesity drugs. I mean, we've heard, I don't think it's been confirmed, but there's a speculation that soda makers are going to be impacted by that. And I think even this week we saw, Novo Nordisk, who makes one of these GLP-1s. They stopped a study early in patients with diabetes and chronic kidney disease. They stopped it early because it had overwhelming efficacy. And so now these drugs appear to have, positive impact for people with chronic kidney disease. And you saw DaVita, which is a company that provides dialysis services to patients with kidney disease. You saw their stock fall because there's this idea that maybe patients aren't going to need as much dialysis. So it's just incredible, like sort of how broad the impact of these drugs have been.
What a time.
And also the magnitude and speed of the market reactions, I think, is what's been so striking to me. Like, it is legitimately a panic. The decline in DaVita and also Fresenius, another company that also does dialysis, was like 20%. So billions of dollars cut off of the market values of these companies that have cornered the market on this like massive part of our healthcare system, which is dialysis. Kidney disease is a huge problem in this country based on not data, not an FDA approval of Ozempic, but a press release saying simply that we stopped a trial early for efficacy. We have no idea. I mean, we can assume the efficacy is pretty strong or you wouldn't have stopped it early. But my point is, markets are moving. Multiple billions of dollars of value are being swung based upon basically like whispers around GLP-1 treatments and this assumption that they will become, I don't know, like fluoride in the water at some point and just massively transform you hinted at earlier, Adam, but like Walmart, Coca-Cola, McDonald's are all facing questions on their investor calls about like, what kind of impact do you expect this to have?
Yeah, it's incredible. It's incredible. Yeah.
And it's just, I mean, I guess we've seen this happens on Wall Street. It is kind of a space famously prone to groupthink, let's say, would be like a polite way of framing it. And I do think we might look back upon some of this and laugh, because I just don't think that... I just sincerely doubt that airline stocks, McDonald's, et cetera, will be forever changed by the introduction of a pharmaceutical product. Not to downplay how obviously, the demand for these medicines already exists and the power that they have, but it's worth noting that their manufacturers cannot meet current demand, let alone, I don't even know how you gamed it out, what the adoption rate of these medicines would have to be to have the economic effects that are implied by these stock market moves. But I think historically we've seen these swings in sentiment that you see, they tend to just overreach, right, in one direction or the other, and I think we're seeing that with these GLP-1s. But look, they're having this huge impact in the market. I mean, we talk a lot about biotech stocks and how they're in this prolonged slump, and part of the reason is that when you look at generalist investors who control and marshal most of the money in the stock market, to those people who are not sort of heavily invested in biotech, or who don't have the deep knowledge in healthcare and biotech, a lot of those people are just looking. A lot of those funds are just saying, hey, all I need to do is invest in Eli Lilly, right? All I need to do is invest in the GLP-1 thesis, because that's what's important. That's what's driving the market these days. And why should I try to sort of understand and get in the weeds of some of these more specialized biotech companies? And that's one of the reasons why biotech stocks
are down. Are down this year and, underperforming the market. Obviously, interest rates and all sort of the macroeconomic factors are sort of negatively impacting biotech stocks as well. But honestly, it's like, a lot of generalist investors out there are like, all I need to do is invest in Eli Lilly and GLP-1s. That's it.
So who knows what the market might be like by time either of these things is ready for prime time. But I do want to just give a mention to one of my favorite things on the stat website this week. Shout out to our multimedia team. The CRISPR'ing of different animals like chickens and pigs. I mean, pigs specifically, we are getting.
It was a big week for barnyard
data.
Animals, wasn't it? It was a big week for
big week for barnyard animals. We don't
Yeah.
talk about it enough on this podcast. I don't know who has the barnyard animal beat at stat. That is to be determined. But we got some of our first xenotransplantation data in the forms of pig organs, showing pretty decent efficacy. It feels remarkable because xenotransplantation has been this idea that feels like it's been floating out there in the minds of some folks in biotech. I mean, notably George Church has been really interested in this field, and the company at the center of this, eGenesis, was co-founded by George. But we are actually starting to see some data that this might work.
Yeah, I mean, the news this week from eGenesis, which is part of a larger and pretty massive and long-term effort to make xenotransplantation real, is that they basically CRISPR'd a pig to have up to 69 genetic changes. This is the most CRISPR'd creature in known history, to produce kidneys that were then implanted into monkeys, and they functioned well for an average of 176 days, and for the eldest of the animals, or the longest term procedure, for more than 2 years. Our colleague Megan Multeney wrote up the news for Stat this week. This was published in Nature, and it's an advance. I mean, the kidney program is not necessarily ready for human trials, at least in the United States. eGenesis plans to conduct another long-term monkey study that could take a few years before asking the FDA for permission, but it is advancing in Japan, where the need for transplant organs is more acute. And also, it's worth noting this follows a lot of work that's happened to where there already has been a pig heart implanted into a guy at the University of Maryland. Was that last year, 2 years ago? Anyway, he is still alive. I don't think he's been discharged from the hospital, but this is an effort that is bearing fruit after, Allison, like you mentioned, many, many, many years of theoretical promise that ran into serious scientific issues. And one of the big things is, obviously the fear of the recipient, the human immune system, rejecting the organ, which is true for all transplantation, but especially when it comes from an animal, but also
when it's
viruses.
So foreign.
Yeah, exactly. But also viruses that are unique to animals, let's say, that would be very dangerous for people. And so that's where a lot of the CRISPR'ing comes in, these, dozens of individual edits that scientists are making, basically to tamp down the potential for those kinds of infections, these viruses that are endogenous to these animals. And so, the monkey data obviously is sort of a so far so good moment, albeit one that is a reminder of just how much work there is yet to do in this field. And that's true also of the other, as you mentioned, big CRISPR'ing animals news this week, which relates to chickens. And in this case, it is not because we want to harvest organs from chickens, but rather because we want to tamp down the spread of bird flu, which has been alarming, for a long time, but has peaked once more in recent months. And so the notion here for scientists in the UK was to use CRISPR to edit chickens such that they could perhaps have immunity to bird flu, and then you could breed them, and they would be this race of super chickens who, would be immune to this virus. And similarly, the early results were very promising. The scientists made these edits and then exposed the chickens to the flu and got pretty good data with respect to protection. But the issue here is that it really is more of a proof of concept than it is a ready for prime time thing, because everyone involved is conscious of, if you breed chickens who have a certain amount of immunity to the virus, but still kind of harbor it, what you could be doing is creating an incubator for basically a super bird flu that their immune systems would conjure, and then that would be spread throughout chickens, and then you would do something terrible, frankly, and create like a super virus, which is obviously what nobody wants to do. And so that work is still ongoing, and they're looking at, further edits that might be possible to eliminate that possibility and to actually make this practicable. And then you have the further down the line things of how one would implement a broad chicken editing platform across the world, where there are multitudes of cultures and governments that actually, handle the production of poultry. But still, I mean, both cases are just kind of like fascinating applications of CRISPR that made sense on paper for many, many years, but are now bearing fruit in actual science.
I'm really hoping one day I can revisit this conversation that was happening in Cambridge, right outside of Kendall Square, pre-pandemic, where there was somebody in town who wanted to CRISPR rats so that they would not be able to, I think, as easily reproduce. I forget the exact details, but it was the idea was to, kind of reduce, the rodent population in the city using CRISPR. And I don't know what happened with that idea. We had this little thing called the COVID pandemic that I think took higher precedence. But maybe we'll be back on this podcast one time soon to talk about CRISPR'ing rats.
Allison, I was getting really hungry having this conversation, but you just killed my appetite. So thanks for that.
Sorry.
Appreciate it. It's okay. And that does it for another episode of the Readout Loud.
Next week's episode will be recorded live in front of, I guess, a studio audience at the Stat Summit that you have heard about already. So if you are going to be in Boston or you already have tickets for that, we look forward to seeing your hopefully smiling faces there. And if not, and you simply tune in and are curious as to why it seems echoey and there are people, again, hopefully clapping, that's why. Anyway, as for this episode, we want to thank Teresa Gaffney for producing it.
Our senior producers are Hyacinth Empanato and Alyssa Ambrose. Our executive producer is Rick Burke, and our theme music is by Brian Joel.
We'd love to hear from you. Tell us what you like about this week's episode, what you didn't like, and whether you, like NASH drug stocks, are being impacted by the GLP-1s. You can do all that by sending us an email at readoutloud@statnews.com.
And if you like what we do, leave a review or a rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you use to get your podcasts.
See you next week.
Sadly is not. Why don't I that's not the energy I want listeners to begin with. Okay.